All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a perspective on the origins of modern Israel that really challenges the story many of us are familiar with. The source material we're looking at builds a case using history, law, and even theology. And our goal here is to just walk you through that case step by step.
Okay, let's just dive right in. This question, our sources basically call this the default narrative. It's this idea of an original sin, that a guilt-ridden West gave Jewish people land that belonged to someone else as a way to make up for the Holocaust. But the material we're digging into today, it sets out to completely dismantle that very idea.
And this quote is what really kicks the whole thing off. This statement from journalist Melanie Phillips is presented in our sources as a direct comeback to that default narrative. I mean, that's a really bold claim, right? It totally sets the stage for a complete reframing of the entire story.
So how exactly do the sources build this counter-argument? Well, it all starts by going after the very foundation of the story we just talked about.
So the whole point here, according to this perspective, is that focusing on the Holocaust is actually a historical misdirection. It suggests that to really, truly understand the situation, we have to look back way further, not just decades, but millennia, long before World War II ever happened. So the first big pillar of this counter-narrative is a claim about ancient history. Specifically, it's an argument for an unbroken, continuous Jewish connection to the land.
Okay, so this slide lays out 4 key historical points from the source material. First, the idea is that the ancient Jewish kingdom is unique in the history of that specific piece of land. Second, they point out that this kingdom existed hundreds of years before the invention of Islam. Third, they argue that even under different empires and occupations, a Jewish presence always remained. And finally, that this all led to a Jewish majority in the city of Jerusalem well before the 20th century even began. So this timeline kind of lays it all out visually. It starts 3,000 years ago with that ancient kingdom. Then it jumps to the 2nd century when the Romans renamed the land Palestine, which, and this is key to their argument, they say was a deliberate attempt to erase its Jewish identity. Then you see this continuous, even if small, Jewish presence all the way through to the mid-1800s when a Jewish majority was actually recorded in Jerusalem. The whole claim here is about persistent historical roots. Okay, so moving on from ancient history, the source material then builds out a legal case. Let's dig into how it connects a political movement in Britain all the way to modern international law. So what the sources say is that the political momentum wasn't just coming from the Jewish community. There was this really powerful movement of Christian Zionists in Britain, even inside the government, who saw it as a kind of religious and moral duty to help bring back a Jewish homeland.
And this political will, they argue, was then turned into actual law through this 3-step process. First, you've got the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Second, that gets formalized by the League of Nations, which created what the sources call a binding international treaty for Britain. And third, after World War II, the UN's own charter just absorbed those obligations. And this right here, this is the legal linchpin of the whole argument. And abrogated, if you're wondering, just means repealed or canceled. The sources are basically contending that because the rules of that mandate were never officially canceled, the legal right for Jews to settle in that territory, well, that it's still internationally valid today.
All right, so this next part, this is where we get into what is probably one of the most contentious claims in the source material. It's about the very definition and the origin of Palestinian identity itself. The argument being presented here is that the word Palestinian has gone through this huge shift in meaning. The sources claim that back during the British Mandate, Palestinians were the Jews. They then assert that a separate, distinct Arab-Palestinian national identity didn't even exist until it was, and this is their word, invented in the mid-1960s. So this lays out a whole demographic story that, pushes back directly against that common narrative of displacement. The sources claimed the land was pretty sparsely populated and that Arab immigration into the region actually went up as Jewish development created new jobs. They attribute the displacement in 1948 to the war started by Arab states, and they point to the Arabs who stayed and became Israeli citizens as evidence that refutes claims of ethnic cleansing. Okay, so now we're going to pivot to the final layer of this argument, the one that's presented in the sources. And this one moves beyond history and law and goes right into the realm of theology.
This question really sets up the final piece of the puzzle that's presented in the source material, the one it sees as the most crucial. The core idea here is that, from this perspective, just arguing about secular history or international law, it's never gonna be enough. So, to really get this theological argument, you have to look at how they define anti-Semitism here. It's presented not as just another form of racism, but as something totally unique, almost cosmic, a kind of metaphysical hostility. A pushback against what the sources describe as the divine mission of the Jewish people to, well, to bridge heaven and earth. This quote from the famous medieval Torah commentator Rashi is presented as the ultimate answer. See how it just bypasses all the secular arguments? It makes a direct theological claim that the right to the land doesn't come from man-made laws. It comes directly from God. And really, this is what it all boils down to for this perspective. The conclusion drawn in the source material is that these natural arguments from history, from law, they're always going to fail. The only argument that will actually work in this view is the divine one, because God said so. So what's the big takeaway here? The perspective we've just walked through really tries to reframe the entire conflict. It asks us to consider if this is just a simple fight over a piece of land, or if it's actually something much deeper. A fundamental clash between two completely different stories, different legal claims, and different missions. And that is the question at the very heart of the source material we looked at today.